In the wind-swept prairies of Nebraska territory, where storms could kill a man in minutes and survival meant everything, one wealthy widow made an offer that shocked every soul in 3 counties. Her challenge was simple, but deadly. Survive the worst storm of the season in her remote cabin and claim both the property and her hand in marriage. The year was 1882, and desperate men had tried everything to win Magdalena Caldwell's fortune, but none had been foolish enough to accept her lethal proposition. Her cabin sat directly in Tornado Alley, where nature unleashed its fury with biblical vengeance. Most thought her challenge was just the cruel game of a grief-mad woman, until one stranger decided to prove them all wrong. This is the incredible true story of the only man who dared face both the storm and the mysterious widow who controlled it, discovering that sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden behind the most terrifying trials. If you're ready for a story of courage that will leave you breathless, hit that like button right now. Subscribe and ring that notification bell, because tales like this prove that fortune truly favors the bold. Drop a comment about the most dangerous thing you do for love or money. I read every single one. The year was 1882, and the town of Cedar Ridge, Nebraska territory, had never seen a woman like Magdalena Caldwell. She'd arrived 5 years earlier as the bride of wealthy cattle baron Edmund Caldwell, bringing with her a dowry that tripled his already substantial fortune and a beauty that made grown men forget their own names when she passed. Edmund's death in a stampede the previous spring had left Magdalena the richest woman in 3 counties, owner of vast cattle ranges, a sprawling ranch house, and most mysteriously, a remote cabin that sat directly in the path of the territory's most violent storms. The cabin had been Edmund's obsession, built to withstand anything nature could unleash. What made the townspeople whisper wasn't Magdalena's wealth or beauty, but her strange behavior since becoming a widow. She'd rejected every suitor who came calling, from neighboring ranchers to traveling businessmen, claiming that no man was worthy of Edmund's legacy unless he could prove himself through trial by ordeal rather than empty courtship gestures. The challenge came during the autumn of 1882, announced at the town's harvest festival, where Magdalena appeared in her finest black silk dress, her dark hair pinned with silver combs that caught the lamplight like stars. She climbed onto the platform where the auctioneer usually stood and addressed the crowd with a voice that carried across the silent gathering. "Gentlemen of Cedar Ridge and beyond," Magdalena announced, her words clear and steady, despite the magnitude of what she was about to propose. "I have grown weary of men who speak of love but have never proven their courage. Any man who wishes to claim my hand and fortune must first survive a test that will separate the worthy from the weak." The crowd leaned forward as Magdalena continued, describing her challenge with the precision of someone who had planned every detail. "My late husband's storm cabin sits 20 miles north of town, directly in the path where nature unleashes her greatest fury. The man who can survive 3 days and nights alone in that cabin during the next great storm will win everything I possess." Murmurs rippled through the gathering as men calculated the risks and rewards of such an undertaking. The storm cabin was legendary throughout the territory, built by Edmund Caldwell to study the violent weather patterns that swept across the plains. Stories said it was designed to withstand tornado-force winds, but no one had ever tested its limits during a true killer storm. "The cabin is stocked with enough supplies for 1 week," Magdalena explained, her green eyes scanning the faces of potential suitors. "The man who accepts my challenge must enter the cabin when the storm clouds gather and remain inside until the weather clears completely. No leaving for any reason, no assistance from outside, no abandoning the test when nature shows her teeth." The widow's announcement sent shockwaves through Cedar Ridge's social circles. Some called her mad with grief. Others accused her of trying to commit murder through weather, but many recognized the cold calculation behind her challenge. Magdalena Caldwell wasn't seeking a husband. She was seeking someone strong enough to match her late husband's legendary courage. Dr. Samuel Morrison, the town's physician and a longtime family friend, approached Magdalena after her announcement with obvious concern. "Maggie, that cabin may be well built, but the storms out there can kill the strongest man alive. You're asking someone to gamble their life for your hand, and that's not courtship, that's Russian roulette with the weather." Magdalena's response revealed the steel beneath her refined exterior. "Samuel, Edmund survived 17 storms in that cabin while studying weather patterns. He designed it specifically to protect human life during the worst conditions nature can produce. Any man worthy of taking his place should possess the courage to trust in Edmund's engineering and his own survival instincts." Word of the widow's challenge spread across Nebraska territory like wildfire, attracting attention from fortune hunters, desperate men, and curious observers who wanted to witness what many considered the most unusual courtship ritual in frontier history. Newspapers as far away as Omaha and Denver carried stories about the wealthy widow's deadly marriage test. The first volunteers appeared within days of Magdalena's announcement, though most lost their nerve when they actually saw the isolated storm cabin and understood the true magnitude of what they were attempting. The structure sat on a barren hill, surrounded by nothing but open prairie, perfectly positioned to receive the full force of any weather system moving across the plains. Jake Morrison, a local ranch hand with more courage than sense, became the first man to officially accept the challenge when storm clouds began gathering in early November. He lasted exactly 6 hours in the cabin before emerging pale and shaken, claiming that the howling wind and rattling walls had convinced him that death was preferable to winning Magdalena's hand under such terrifying circumstances. 3 more men attempted the challenge over the following weeks, each failing to complete even a single night in the storm cabin. Word spread that Magdalena Caldwell's test was impossible, that she was either insane or deliberately trying to ensure that no man could ever claim her fortune. The widow herself made no comment on the failures, simply waiting for someone brave enough to succeed. As winter approached and the storm season intensified, most people assumed that Magdalena's challenge would remain unmet. The combination of deadly weather, complete isolation, and psychological pressure had proven too much for every man who'd attempted it. The wealthy widow seemed destined to remain alone with her impossible standards and her deadly test. But fate had other plans for Magdalena Caldwell and her storm cabin challenge. On a cold December morning, a stranger rode into Cedar Ridge, leading a pack horse and asking directions to the widow's ranch. He'd heard about the challenge from travelers passing through Colorado territory, and he'd come to Nebraska for the express purpose of winning Magdalena's hand and fortune through trial by storm. The stranger's arrival marked the beginning of a test that would challenge everything the people of Cedar Ridge believed about courage, survival, and the power of human determination when faced with nature's most violent fury. Magdalena's impossible challenge was about to meet the only man desperate and skilled enough to attempt it seriously. The stranger who rode into Cedar Ridge on that frigid December morning looked like he'd been carved from the same hard stone as the mountains he'd crossed to get there. Caleb Thornton stood 6 feet tall in worn leather boots, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent facing nature's worst moods without flinching or backing down. Caleb had spent the last 5 years working as a mountain guide and trapper in the Colorado Rockies, surviving blizzards that killed lesser men and learning to read weather patterns with the accuracy of a Cheyenne scout. His reputation for surviving impossible conditions had spread through mining camps and trading posts across 3 territories, earning him respect from men who didn't give it easily. The death of his younger brother in an avalanche the previous spring had left Caleb with nothing but memories and a burning need to start over somewhere far from the mountains that had claimed the only family he had left. When he heard travelers discussing Magdalena Caldwell's storm challenge in a Denver saloon, Something about the widow's test spoke to his survival instincts and desperate desire for a new beginning. Caleb's first glimpse of Magdalena came when he knocked on the door of her ranch house, hat in hand, but eyes steady as he introduced himself and stated his intention to attempt her challenge. The widow studied him with the calculating gaze of someone who had learned to evaluate men quickly and accurately, taking note of his calm demeanor and obvious physical conditioning. "Mr. Thornton," Magdalena said after inviting him into her parlor, "you're the first man to approach my challenge who doesn't look like he's already planning his own funeral. Tell me what makes you think you can succeed where others have failed so miserably." Her directness matched his own, cutting through social pleasantries to address the life and death reality of what he was proposing. Caleb's response revealed both his practical experience and his understanding of what the challenge truly required. "Ma'am, I've survived mountain storms that would terrify the men who've tried your test. I know how to stay calm when nature's screaming at you, how to conserve energy during long waits, and how to trust in solid construction when everything around you sounds like it's coming apart." The widow's questions continued for over an hour as she probed Caleb's experience, motivations, and mental preparation for what many considered a suicide mission. She described the cabin's construction in detail, explained the supply situation, and made absolutely certain that he understood the no-exit rule that had broken the nerve of every previous challenger who'd attempted her test. "The cabin has reinforced walls, a steel-plated roof, and foundations that go 8 feet into bedrock," Magdalena explained, her voice carrying the pride Edmund had felt in his engineering achievement. "But when a real storm hits, it sounds like the world is ending. The noise alone has driven grown men to panic, and panic kills faster than any tornado in this territory." Caleb listened carefully to every detail, asking practical questions about water supply, ventilation, and emergency procedures that demonstrated his serious preparation for the ordeal ahead. His calm acceptance of the challenge's dangers impressed Magdalena, who had grown accustomed to men either blustering with false bravado or backing down when faced with the reality of what they were attempting. The widow's final question cut to the heart of Caleb's motivations. "Why are you really doing this, Mr. Thornton? My fortune is substantial, but there are easier ways to make money that don't involve risking your life against prairie storms. What drives a man to gamble everything on 3 days in a cabin that's defeated every other challenger?" Caleb's answer revealed the depths of loss and determination that had brought him to Nebraska territory. "Ma'am, I lost everything that mattered to me in those Colorado mountains. My brother, my future, my reason for staying in familiar territory. Your challenge offers me a chance to win not just wealth, but a new life, with a woman strong enough to create a test that separates the worthy from the weak." Magdalena found herself genuinely impressed by Caleb's honesty and his practical approach to her challenge. Unlike the other men who had attempted her test, he seemed to understand that surviving the storm cabin required mental discipline as much as physical endurance. His quiet confidence suggested someone who had faced death before and learned to work with fear rather than against it. The timing proved perfect for Caleb's attempt, as weather reports from the Territorial Meteorological Service indicated that a massive storm system was building over the western plains. The conditions promised to be some of the most severe of the winter season, with sustained winds exceeding 60 miles per hour and the possibility of tornado activity during the storm's peak intensity. Magdalena accompanied Caleb to the storm cabin on the afternoon before the weather hit, riding beside him across the windswept prairie while storm clouds gathered on the western horizon like an advancing army of darkness. The sight of the isolated structure on its barren hill struck both of them as either a monument to human engineering or an elaborate tomb for the foolishly brave. The cabin itself exceeded Caleb's expectations for frontier construction, built with materials and techniques that wouldn't have been out of place in Denver or San Francisco. Edmund Caldwell had spared no expense in creating a structure that could protect human life during the most violent weather conditions the Great Plains could produce, and his engineering showed in every carefully planned detail. "My husband spent 2 years perfecting this design," Magdalena explained as she showed Caleb through the cabin's interior. "The walls are double-thick timber with steel reinforcement. The windows are made from plate glass, thick enough to stop rifle bullets, and the entire structure is anchored to bedrock with steel cables that could hold a suspension bridge." Caleb inspected the supplies that would sustain him during his 3-day ordeal: canned food, fresh water, oil lamps, warm blankets, and a small library of books to help pass the time during the worst of the storm. Everything had been carefully selected to provide physical comfort and mental distraction during what promised to be the longest 3 days of his life. As the first drops of rain began falling and lightning flickered in the western sky, Magdalena prepared to leave Caleb alone with his challenge. "The storm should reach full intensity within 6 hours, she told him, her voice carrying a mixture of concern and anticipation. "Remember, no leaving the cabin for any reason until the weather clears completely. Many men have failed this test, not because of the storm, but because of their own fear." Caleb watched from the cabin doorway as Magdalena rode back toward town, her figure disappearing into the gathering darkness as the wind began to howl across the prairie with increasing intensity. Behind him, the cabin's solid walls and reinforced construction offered protection from the coming storm, but ahead lay 3 days that would test every survival skill he had learned during his years in the wilderness. The storm arrived with the fury of a freight train, hitting the cabin with winds that screamed like banshees and rain that struck the reinforced windows with the force of rifle bullets. Caleb had experienced mountain blizzards and valley floods, but nothing in his wilderness experience had prepared him for the raw, sustained violence of a Great Plains storm system. By midnight, the cabin was shaking on its foundations, despite Edmund Caldwell's masterful engineering, and the noise had reached levels that made normal thought almost impossible. Caleb forced himself to remain calm, using meditation techniques learned during long mountain winters when survival depended on conserving energy and maintaining mental discipline through extended periods of isolation and stress. The first test of Caleb's resolve came when a section of the cabin's roof began making ominous creaking sounds that suggested structural failure might be imminent. Lesser men had fled the cabin at this point, convinced that staying meant certain death, but Caleb's experience with mountain construction told him that well-built structures often made alarming noises without actually failing. Hour after hour, the storm continued its assault on the cabin, with winds that varied between howling fury and terrifying silence that made Caleb wonder if the eye of a tornado was passing overhead. He used his time constructively, reading from Edmund's technical journals about storm construction and weather patterns, learning about the man whose engineering skill was literally keeping him alive. The psychological pressure proved more challenging than the physical discomfort, as the constant noise and vibration created a sensory assault that threatened to drive even experienced survivors to panic. Caleb drew on techniques learned during avalanche rescues, when remaining calm in buried conditions meant the difference between life and death for both rescuer and victim, using controlled breathing to maintain mental clarity. Dawn of the second day brought no relief from the storm's intensity, and Caleb realized that this weather system exceeded even Magdalena's expectations for severity. The winds had shifted direction multiple times during the night, testing every aspect of the cabin's construction, while lightning strikes came close enough to illuminate the interior, despite the heavy window coverings designed to block psychological intimidation. The true test of the cabin's engineering came when a tornado touched down less than half a mile away, its roar audible even above the storm's constant howling. Caleb felt the cabin's foundations vibrate as the twister passed nearby, but Edmund's anchoring system held firm. proving that the structure could indeed withstand nature's most violent atmospheric phenomena without compromising the safety of its occupant. By the second night, Caleb had settled into a survival routine that conserved both physical energy and mental focus. He ate sparingly from the supplies, maintaining strength without wasting resources, and used the cabin's extensive library to keep his mind occupied during the worst periods, when the storm's noise made sleep impossible and fear threatened to overwhelm rational thought. The storm's peak intensity came during the early hours of the third day, with sustained winds that exceeded anything recorded in the territory's meteorological history. Trees visible from the cabin's windows bent almost horizontal under the wind's force, and debris flew past at velocities that would have killed anyone caught in the open, validating Magdalena's insistence that the challenge could only be survived inside Edmund's fortress-like structure. Caleb's mountain training proved invaluable during the storm's climax, as his experience with extreme weather conditions allowed him to recognize the signs that indicated the worst was passing. The subtle changes in wind patterns, the gradual decrease in debris, strikes against the cabin, and the lengthening intervals between lightning strikes all suggested that the storm system was finally beginning to weaken. The psychological toll of 3 days in constant storm conditions tested every aspect of Caleb's mental preparation, but his wilderness experience had taught him to work with fear rather than against it. He used the terror that threatened to overwhelm him as fuel for increased alertness and careful attention to the cabin's performance under extreme conditions, turning survival instinct into productive activity. Edmund's journals provided unexpected companionship during the longest hours, as Caleb read about the cattle baron's own experiences testing the cabin during previous storms. The dead man's detailed observations about structural performance and psychological challenges helped Caleb understand that his fear and discomfort were normal responses to abnormal conditions, not signs of personal weakness or impending failure. The third night brought the storm's final assault, with winds that seemed determined to destroy everything the previous days had failed to demolish. Caleb spent those hours checking and rechecking the cabin's critical systems, ensuring that doors remained secure, windows stayed intact, and the ventilation system continued functioning despite the debris that threatened to block crucial air circulation. As dawn approached on the fourth day, the storm's intensity began decreasing noticeably for the first time since Caleb had entered the cabin. The wind's howling dropped to a manageable roar, the rain decreased from driving torrents to heavy downpour, and the lightning moved far enough away that its thunder no longer shook the cabin's reinforced walls with each strike. Caleb's survival instincts told him that the worst had passed. But Magdalena's rules required him to remain in the cabin until the weather cleared completely. He used these final hours to clean and organize the cabin, preparing it for the next challenger while reflecting on the incredible engineering achievement that had preserved his life during 3 days of meteorological hell. When sunshine finally broke through the departing clouds on the fourth afternoon, Caleb emerged from Edmund Caldwell's storm cabin as the first and only man to successfully complete Magdalena's impossible challenge. He had survived not only the worst storm in the territory's recorded history, but also the psychological ordeal of complete isolation while nature unleashed her most violent fury against his temporary fortress. The sight of Magdalena riding across the prairie toward the cabin filled Caleb with emotions he hadn't expected, not just triumph at completing the challenge, but genuine anticipation for the future he had won through 3 days of courage, determination, and trust in a dead man's engineering genius. The storm had tested everything he possessed, and he had proven worthy of the prize. Magdalena's expression as she approached the cabin revealed her own amazement that someone had finally succeeded where so many others had failed. She had designed the challenge expecting it to remain unmet, but Caleb Thornton had proven that the right combination of experience, mental preparation, and sheer determination could overcome even the most terrifying natural forces when backed by superior human engineering. Magdalena dismounted from her horse with hands that trembled slightly, staring at Caleb as if he were a ghost risen from the grave rather than a living man who had accomplished what everyone believed impossible. 3 days of worry had taken their toll on the widow, despite her outward confidence that the cabin could protect anyone brave enough to remain inside during a major storm. "You actually did it," she said quietly, her voice carrying a mixture of admiration and disbelief. "You survived the worst storm in territorial history, without breaking, without running, without giving up, when the fear became unbearable. I'm not sure whether to congratulate your courage or question your sanity for attempting something so dangerous." Caleb's response revealed the depth of his commitment to the challenge, and his growing understanding of what Magdalena had really been seeking through her impossible test. "Ma'am, that storm tested everything I am, my experience, my courage, my ability to think clearly when death seems certain. But it also tested your husband's engineering, and both of us passed." The conversation that followed marked the beginning of a relationship built on mutual respect rather than conventional romance, as Magdalena and Caleb discovered that surviving her challenge had created a bond deeper than typical courtship could achieve. They had both gambled everything on the outcome, he his life, she her future, and both had proven worthy of what they'd risked. Magdalena's tour of the storm-damaged landscape surrounding the cabin revealed the true magnitude of what Caleb had endured during his 3-day ordeal. Trees had been uprooted, buildings destroyed, and livestock killed across dozens of square miles, while the cabin stood virtually undamaged despite taking the full force of the storm's fury throughout its entire duration. Edmund designed this cabin to protect anyone strong enough to trust in his engineering, Magdalena explained as they examined the minimal damage to the structure's exterior. But he also knew that surviving inside during a real storm required mental strength that most men don't possess. You've proven that you have both the courage to face nature's worst and the wisdom to recognize superior craftsmanship. Indeed, the ride back to Cedar Ridge became an extended conversation about their respective backgrounds, motivations, and plans for a future that neither had been certain would actually occur. Caleb learned that Magdalena's challenge hadn't been motivated by grief-induced madness, but by determination to find a man worthy of Edmund's legacy and capable of continuing his work in weather research and storm-resistant construction. Magdalena discovered that Caleb's wilderness experience included skills that perfectly complemented Edmund's scientific interests, as his years of mountain survival had taught him to read weather patterns, predict atmospheric changes, and understand the relationship between human engineering and natural forces. Their partnership promised to be both romantic and professional, combining her resources with his expertise. The news of Caleb's success spread through Cedar Ridge faster than prairie fire, drawing crowds of curious townspeople who wanted to see the man who had accomplished what everyone considered impossible. His calm demeanor and practical answers to their questions impressed even the skeptics who had assumed that Magdalena's challenge was designed to remain unmet forever. Dr. Samuel Morrison, who had predicted disaster from the beginning, examined Caleb carefully for signs of physical or psychological damage from his ordeal. "You show no signs of the trauma I expected from 3 days in those conditions," the physician admitted. "Either you're tougher than anyone I've ever met, or Edmund Caldwell's engineering was even better than we realized." Bro. The wedding of Magdalena Caldwell and Caleb Thornton took place 6 weeks later, attended by representatives from throughout Nebraska territory who came to witness the marriage of the couple whose courtship had captured the imagination of everyone who heard their story. The ceremony celebrated not just their union, but the triumph of human courage and engineering over nature's most violent forces. Caleb's integration into Edmund's business empire revealed new opportunities for expansion and innovation, as his survival expertise complemented the cattle baron's vision of creating settlements that could withstand the Great Plains' harsh weather conditions. Together, they began developing construction techniques and emergency procedures that would save countless lives during future storms. The storm cabin became a symbol of their partnership, serving as both a testing ground for new weather-resistant designs and a reminder of the challenge that had brought them together. Caleb made regular improvements to the structure based on his survival experience, while Magdalena documented everything for publication in territorial newspapers and scientific journals. Their marriage proved as solid as Edmund's engineering, built on the foundation of mutual respect that had developed during Magdalena's impossible challenge and Caleb's successful completion of it. Both had risked everything on the outcome, and both had discovered that the greatest rewards come to those willing to face their fears with courage and determination. The couple's first child was born during a violent spring storm, arriving safely in their ranch house while nature unleashed her fury outside. They named him Edmund, honoring the man whose engineering genius had made their meeting possible and whose legacy continued through their partnership in developing storm-resistant construction techniques for frontier communities. Years later, when territorial historians wrote about the development of Nebraska's weather-resistant architecture, they traced its origins to the challenge that brought Magdalena and Caleb together. The storm cabin that had tested one man's courage became the prototype for buildings that protected thousands of settlers from the Great Plains' notorious weather patterns. Caleb never forgot the 3 days that changed his life, often returning to the storm cabin during severe weather to test new improvements and remember the challenge that had won him not just a fortune, but a partner worthy of the risks they had both taken. The widow's impossible test had proven that some prizes can only be claimed by those brave enough to face their fears. The legend of Magdalena's challenge spread throughout the frontier territories, inspiring other communities to develop their own tests of character and courage for those seeking to prove their worth. But none ever matched the pure, terrifying simplicity of surviving 3 days alone with nature's fury, trusting in human engineering and personal determination to overcome impossible odds. Their story became a testament to the power of properly motivated challenges, proving that extraordinary circumstances can reveal extraordinary character in those brave enough to face them. Magdalena had sought a man worthy of Edmund's legacy, and in Caleb Thornton, she had found someone who could not only survive her storm, but help her build a future worthy of the courage that had brought them together.